This is Listen Lakeland, the show that keeps you up to date on all the things that make our city a great place to live, work, and play. Today's host is the driving force behind the Arts and Medicine program at the Watson Clinic Foundation. A Florida Southern graduate, she's dedicated to elevating community and individual health through creative arts initiatives. Her passion lies in creating intersectionality between arts and health to promote holistic well-being for all. Please welcome your host, Tiffany Van Wieren.
Welcome to the good life.
Thank you so much for joining us today. I'm Tiffany Van Wieren, and it's great to be hosting this month's episode of Listen Lakeland. This show is an extension of Lakeland Vision. For over 2 decades, Lakeland Vision has been a voice for the citizens of Lakeland, working with community stakeholders to create a bright future for our city. Today, we're going to be talking about the power of presence, nurturing in-person connections in a digital age. And we have some amazing guests here who are going to kind of share some of the ways we connect here locally and why these connections are so important. Joining us today, we have Gretchen Ceranic from United Way, and she runs the Success by 6 program. We have Stephen Hill, the program director for the Dream Center of Lakeland, and Patricia Henderson, the outreach and community services manager with the Senior Connections Center. Thank you so much, everybody, for being here, and welcome.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
You know, it's hard to talk about connection and why it's so important without talking about its opposites, isolation and loneliness. 2 different things, different ideas under the same umbrella. Isolation being something we can totally measure, it's very objective, versus loneliness really is much more murky. You can be lonely in a crowd of people, right? And so when we think about this idea of loneliness, the CDC defines that as the feeling like you don't have any meaningful close relationships or a sense of belonging. And with 1 in 3 adults suffering from marked loneliness, we all know that loneliness doesn't affect just adults. It affects us at every age and every stage. And I know that even like our young people, from those kids who were born during the pandemic, are now getting to the school age, right? And we're seeing signs from that time. And I know I cannot be the only pandemic mom who had kindergartners that were just starting during the pandemic, who are now 3rd graders who had some gains that they had to make both socially and academically. So lots of experts, and I kind of want to start this conversation around loneliness here, say that we're in an epidemic of loneliness and that it has significant health impacts. So not just in our mental health, but our physical health as well, including, it's very similar to smoking cigarettes. So what they say, what the research is showing, is it has a 29% increase in heart disease, 32% increase in risk of stroke, and this got me 50% increase in risk of dementia. And it's crazy because we're more connected than ever, and yet it seems like in-person connection is really kind of where we're at. So I kind of want to start there. I want to hear about each of the populations that you all serve and where you see this dynamic of isolation, loneliness, and connection, tug of war kind of playing out, how you see that playing. Let's start, actually, Gretchen, with you.
Okay. So I serve children and families 0 to 6 in our community through United Way of Central Florida. And I see kids, like you said, pandemic babies, who were kept home or kept away from social gatherings, maybe even from extended family, that are really missing out on that skill, that social skill that is so important, especially for starting school and just a life skill. They often don't know the basic things like sharing, taking turns, asking a question, right? They're used to interacting with a parent or a caregiver. And so when they're coming to the Children's Resource Center, which is one of our initiatives at Bonnet Springs Park, where we host weekly classes and programs at no cost for families, we see kids that are very quiet, very, very isolated to themselves. And it's not the typical shy child. It is, I don't know how to interact with my peers. Mm-hmm. And so that is a huge concern. And I think that we're getting out of that. I'm seeing less and less of that. And I do think it is a skill that we all need to be successful adults.
Oh, yes, definitely. How about, I'm actually going to go to the opposite spectrum. I think we're going to come back to you, Stephen.
No problem.
Patricia, how does this affect, I mean, typically when we think of loneliness, we think of it as something that does primarily affect older adults. That's not necessarily true, but I think that there is a reason for that. So can you kind of speak to that?
Well, there are many aspects of older adults being lonely, and as opposed to what Gretchen was mentioning about them not knowing how to interact, it's not knowing with whom to interact or not finding that group of people anymore, whether it is because they've lost a spouse, they've outlived their friends, they've moved to a new, maybe it's an assisted living or a new independent community. It's about making friends all over again, like you did when you first went to school, and now you're in later life, and it's finding that new group of friends. And sometimes that becomes more difficult. Isolation did not begin with the pandemic for many older adults, but it was just heightened during that time. Issues such as mobility, transportation, and other issues that isolated individuals, older adults, before the pandemic were just heightened, and they continue to exist after the pandemic waned. One of the things that we know is that isolation is also a risk factor, and one of the main risk factors for becoming a victim of abuse, neglect, or exploitation. And so it has another factor and another negative factor when it comes to older adults.
That's really interesting that you kind of say that. And it's also interesting because these two different worlds, right? We have our world where that's very expansive and it's expanding when we're children, and a world that seems to be, or feels like often that it feels like it's shrinking as we get older, and how we kind of have to find new ways to embrace almost our inner child as we get older in that connection.
Absolutely.
Okay, so Stephen, tell me a little about the Dream Center and the population that you serve.
Sure. The Dream Center works with low-risk and high-need communities throughout Lakeland. We're focused in the Midtown area, but now have spread out with local partners that have identified Lakeland is so spread and continues to spread. And so identifying other pockets of communities that tend to be high poverty and trying to bring resources into those spaces. For us, as we're doing that, we've found we can bring resources. We can get food or clothing or bring partners in to help with some other areas that can help in those communities. But we've also found that if we want to move somebody on beyond a space where they need those resources for the rest of their life, a big part of that is getting them plugged in with community. That having a supportive community of people that will say, hey, we see potential. There's a way past this. You don't have to spend the rest of your life in a food bank line. There's other opportunities available, is a big part of whether or not that person's going to succeed in that or feel isolated. Sometimes your low-income communities can't have a great, strong community, especially those where there's maybe some generational experience there. But sometimes somebody's in that situation because maybe they've made some choices that weren't the best choices, and as a result have been cut off and isolated, and now that kind of spirals out. And so being able to bring people around to support in those spaces can be very helpful.
So you're kind of touching on a little bit of what Patricia kind of touched on, which is barriers to connection, right? Sure. They're, spiraling out. Being financially, independent can be a real challenge and a real barrier to connection. And a lot of these, as Patricia, as you said, didn't start with the pandemic, but it did give us a nice way to kind of talk about these issues, I think. So let's kind of talk about that and explore that a little bit, those connection or those barriers to connection. So what would you say within those populations you work with are the real kind of troublesome barriers that just make it difficult?
So for my case, I see language being a barrier in especially Lakeland and the area that the resource center is at. There's a large Spanish-speaking population, and so they often, feel isolated as a result of that. Whether that's the case or not, that's how they feel, and so that's important to recognize that and work through that. And we try very hard to make sure all of our programming and all of our information is bilingual so that we can reach those families that need us the most. But I would also say that I think someone mentioned it, Patricia, the economic barrier. in order to get your children exposed and provide these enrichment opportunities, oftentimes costs money. And that is a huge barrier for a lot of families. And so, again, the Resource Center, there is no cost to any of our programming. So we try to eliminate that right up front to make sure that people of all walks of life can bring their child for free enrichment. When you come to any of our programming, you have the entire park as well to extend that enrichment. Studies show that lower income families that are stuck in the home with a young child, there is a much larger increase of stress and child abuse associated with that, because the child's bored, you're completely stressed out. You might be getting people calling about bills, and the house needs repair. Well, if you can get those families outside of the home doing something enriching, building that connection with that parent, which is so important, and then providing it at no cost is so important. And Lakeland does a great job, I feel, of providing opportunities for families. But again, at the Resource Center, we have access to use the park. And so these families can come to a program at no cost, receive enrichment, parents learn skills, children learn early education skills, literacy skills. They can go play in the park, they can go play in the museum, and then by the time they get home, hopefully the child's tired and ready for a nap, and mom's like, okay, I got this. I can do this for another day.
And it's interesting that you mentioned like that free component, because I know that the Children's Museum also has a program for EBT families that they can get a membership for free. So if any of our listeners have anything like that maybe you do have an EBT card, and especially with summer coming up, that's a great resource to have. And knowing that the Resource Center is there as well is really amazing. How about anybody else for just the barriers to connection?
Transportation is a huge barrier. For many older adults who have given up driving, or maybe they never learned to drive, or the expense of a car is no longer in their budget. So it is one of the biggest factors, I believe, is transportation.
Oh yeah, and and even people with disabilities as well. I was just talking with somebody who she is a navigator, and she helps people to navigate our bus system. And she said, the first time I went on it, it was actually very confusing. And so navigating that whole world is a challenge in and of itself. And we're just not spaced the same way that, so maybe some other cities are. And we are so growing so much that having, transportation is a real challenge, I think. What do you think is some of the barriers?
Sure. I'd agree with both the statements on language. We're experiencing more and more of that. We went from one family 3 years ago in our community coming to food distributions that was Hispanic to now I think 40% of those that come out are from a Hispanic family. And so we're experiencing that. We've had to get translators and volunteers and groups involved to be able to reach to now we've got 5 different languages that come out. Wow. And so seeing how to reach in that space and finding out that even just making some effort to communicate goes a long way in making somebody feel welcome and seen. And so that's made a big difference. The transportation issue also, there's a lot of programs that are available, but if somebody can't get there, that's not helpful for them. And so trying to bridge those gaps. We're also trying to find ways, I think, as kind of social media has changed the landscape of that, especially as for some of our kids and our students that maybe haven't grown up outside of that, being really intentional with our spaces and thinking about, hey, when somebody comes in, are we going to sit at round tables so that people are having to talk and engage? We do a lot more of kind of guided discussion and creating spaces where people you're sometimes creating kind of crutches socially to walk people through some stuff that maybe they've distanced themselves from or not associated with, or force them into a relationship with people they maybe wouldn't choose to, and they can't just sign offline and not engage anymore. Yeah. We're gonna stay, we're gonna deal with a conflict when it comes up, we're gonna sit with somebody that's a little different from us and see the value in that person rather than just right away move into where I'm comfortable. Yeah. And it's always a little bit uneasy at first, but the relationship that comes out of it is always beneficial. And we have somebody starts coming for a resource and ends up coming in for the friendship that's there.
That's amazing. I love that you kind of touched on that digital versus in-person. The digital world can so often be inauthentic or can drive us to separate spaces. It doesn't always, though. So, during the pandemic, we got to see that a lot of people were able to connect for maybe the first time because of digital resources. So maybe let's kind of explore this idea of the pros and cons of the digital world and access for us, for our students, I'm a former teacher, so so our kids and our aging population. What are some of the pros and cons that you see of this digital universe we live in? And I keep looking at you first. I'm so sorry.
That's okay. I will start. I'm a big fan of the face-to-face because touching on what Stephen said, it is really hard to hate someone when you're sitting across the table looking at them in the eye. It's easy to do that when you're at home in a dark room on your computer. So some of the things that we have started at the Children's Resource Center, we have a Down syndrome support group, we have an autism support group, as well as a new parent support group. And all of those things are allowing people to be seen, to be heard, to be cared for in a way that is really, really hard to do through a computer.
Yeah, it creates a sense of belonging, I think, in the real world, like a real sense of belonging versus... And even in digital media, I think we can create belonging, but we are by nature, I think, face-to-face creatures. Yes. And that who knows if that's going to change, but I don't see it changing anytime soon. But, having those in-person connections you're right. There is something that's very just human about it.
When you see someone crying, in our support groups, we sometimes see that, a parent crying. You don't see that on a computer. Right. You can't reach out and offer comfort in the same way you can when you're face-to-face in a room with someone. So I am a big fan of face-to-face groups, although I do see the value of online support groups for those that can't meet face-to-face.
And tell me about some of the ways that you're now connecting with the population you work with, and how that is beneficial to use digital.
We are using both digital and in-person formats. Digital formats can overcome some of those barriers that we mentioned, the barrier of transportation, the barrier of mobility, the barrier of not wanting to get out of the house. And so it has value, and real connections can be formed. There has to be a greater intentionality about it, I think, than in person. Because sometimes in person, you form relationships or bonds just as a natural course of things. Like you said, you see someone crying, you put your arm around them, or you speak to them, or you can't exit the building if you're not getting along with someone. You have to deal with it. So we do have virtual formats that we do presentations and things such as that on, but we have health and wellness classes that are multi-week workshops that provide the opportunity in person to develop those relationships, and we have seen those relationships go beyond those workshops ending, or groups that didn't know each other when they came in, they end up going to breakfast together after the workshop is over, so those relationships developing. And one of the benefits of in-person for many older adults is that's what they know, that's what they're used to, that's how they developed most of their friendships throughout their life. And having that comfort level increases their confidence within that workshop.
That's really, it's nice to have both. I think we live in a world where we have to kind of embrace both, but I think we have to be intentional about both mediums, really making sure that those connections are authentic. Maybe being a little discomforted, uncomfortable, maybe being a little bit uncomfortable. What about different ways? Because you kind of talked about being in nature just a little bit. You kind of talked about going into nature afterwards. Nature has a really great, it does things to your brain, which is just awesome. And it gives you that awe feeling. You're like, oh, wow. and really kind of connects you outside of yourself, brings you outside of yourself. I know in my role with the Arts and Medicine program, it's housed in the cancer clinic. So we're seeing patients at a very unique time in their lives, but not just patients, we're seeing caregivers as well. And the arts have a huge impact in the way that we connect. I always like to say that art isn't about perfection, it's about connection. And it can be connection to yourself, to another person. It's storytelling, so you're seeing somebody else's story, as you kind of were talking about, Stephen. And I really think that, it's a really cool thing to be able to add into the healthcare medium or into connective programming. Because, for example, for us, when patients come out of the elevator, I love it when the first thing they see is us, because the look on their face is total confusion. Because you expect to do what when you go to the doctor? Sit, and you're not going to talk to your neighbor. What are you going to do? You're going to look down at your phone, and you're probably Googling the very reason that you're at the doctor. And so when they come out of the elevators and they see like maybe one of our volunteers sitting at a table doing some sort of arts activity, it immediately takes them in a different direction than where they're at. And of course, if you're sitting isolated and looking at your phone, you're just building up that fight or flight response. And loneliness really is a state, it's an unrest state. And so I would love to hear from you guys. I know that for our program, the arts are a wonderful medium to do that. Have you found any ways that are innovative, that are unique or creative to connect people within your individual programs? See, I didn't look at you, Gretchen. I looked over at Patricia this time.
Well, one of the things that I think is really important is that common purpose and making those connections through that common purpose, whether that common purpose is coming to a workshop to learn how to improve your balance or to improve your how you manage your diabetes, or volunteering for the same purpose, and because you're both interested in that same thing, or going to a class and learning about the same subject.
Oh, yeah.
But common purpose, I think, is a great way to connect with people.
And you mentioned volunteering, and I love that. And I know that we all have organizations that utilize volunteers. And that is such a wonderful and unique way to help reduce isolation and loneliness. Has proven physiological benefits, and there's so many great organizations right here in Lakeland that you can volunteer with. And that's a wonderful way to connect. Stephen, what would you say about that?
I was going to touch on the volunteering side as well, and on a number of levels. One, so we'll partner with groups to volunteer. And so I think when I first came to the Dream Center, and a lot of people that will come into a space where you're serving, there's an idea that, hey, we're going to go help those that really need it. And that's a big part of what we want to do. But what we find is as we go out and do that oftentimes it's reciprocated in the community. And one of the things that we've begun to find recently has been really helpful is to invite those who are receiving services to volunteer alongside. And it creates a community that goes past like, hey, here's this person that I've helped up, to now seeing, hey, this is somebody that's very similar to me. And maybe there's like bringing connection that pulls both the volunteer that's coming from outside of the community and the one that may live there, or the resident that's in low income or facing that hard time, and bringing that commonality. Which is helpful on both sides. It also is really helpful to that person that's receiving something to identify that they are able to participate, to be able to give back, that they see a value in that. And that community that forms out of our volunteers is always our strongest. It's always our strongest group.
I'm going to jump in too, if that's okay.
Yeah.
And agree with the volunteer piece, because I always say that people think when they volunteer, it's a selfless act, but it ends up being kind of a selfish act because you end up getting more out of it oftentimes than what you think you're providing for this person.
And the research backs that up too.
Yes.
That oftentimes when you are giving kind of grows, but it also, of your time, especially in the volunteer world, it actually has even more effects than the person on the other end.
It's a beautiful gift that you give
Absolutely.
yourself and others. And United Way has a wonderful program called Reading Pals, where
that's a great
a
program.
volunteer will be paired up and mentor a kindergarten student that is maybe struggling socially, maybe they have some issues at home, and with their reading skills. So this volunteer will meet with them once a week, and help them get caught up, spend some one-on-one time, 1 hour once a week. It's a very low commitment volunteer opportunity, but it's so enriching. These little kids become your best friend, and they are so happy to see you every time you come in. It's interesting. We just looked at some studies, and we know that attendees. School attendance is very important, and when kids are in school, they do better. And the superintendent was just talking about how he needs to help increase that number of absentees. Kids that are in the Reading Pals program have a far greater attendance than those not, because they know somebody's coming to see them.
Yes.
They have a person.
Yes.
And they don't want to miss that person.
Oh, I love that. And
they also have a lower discipline because, again, they have that buddy who is there for them, that provides that love and support and encouragement. So we talk about education being so important, but I really think that that is secondary to kids feeling loved and seen. And that's what this Reading Pals program does for our students.
And it goes back to that belonging, right? Being seen as equals belonging. And I have volunteers that work with me that actually do the Reading Pals program, and they love it. They're always talking about their littles that they read to. So kind of wrapping up, I want to talk about something. There was a best practices, so National Health Guidelines for Social Connection. Did you guys know there was a blueprint for this? Neither did I until I was looking at loneliness and isolation in preparation for this. It was actually Julianne Holt. I'm going to totally butcher her name. I hope not. Julianne Holt Lundstad, and she actually worked with a national program. Tons of research went into it, and she developed some it was a team of people, best practices. And they come in 4 different domains. And I'd love to see if you guys have something to add to this. But just like we think of diet, best practices for sleep, best practices for nutrition, for physical health. This is that for social connection. And so it comes in 4 different areas. One is quality and size, frequency, source, and context. So quality and size, obviously you want to at least have one person that you're connecting with, but where they saw the most benefit was between 4 and 6 individuals, having a relationship with 4 to 6 individuals. Frequency, you want at least once daily, obviously more than that. Source, you want to think diversity. So we were talking, Stephen, you mentioned people with differing views. And this also means people with different social roles. So maybe being around just your husband and kids, for me, all the time, that's your only connection. You need to diversify that, maybe whether it's with friends or mentors or partners. And then, of course, context. So that's location. But not only location, you think about like where you go to connect, right? So you maybe you're a faith-based organization, maybe Rotary or Kiwanis or another club like that, or you do a running club, or you go to the Senior Connection Center or to the Resource Center. These different areas that we can connect with other individuals. So that kind of context piece, and just like we limit sweets in our diet, we want to limit the amount of digital connection that we have and focus primarily on in-person if we can. Are there other things that you guys think that should have been included in that, really? In that sort of idea of social connection guidelines?
I would add to the diversity piece, intergenerational. I think that's really important for both older adults and for younger adults to get to know somebody different.
Yes.
To learn those stories and to learn that aging is not bad.
Oh, yeah. And this is definitely a very large conversation that needs to happen, both on the local and national and worldwide level, because we are creatures of connection. But I'm so glad that you guys were here today with me to kind of talk and explore this whole topic. I think that it's going to be a wonderful conversation to continue. So thank you so much for joining us today and for tuning in to Listen Lakeland. Your feedback is valued, and we encourage you to head over to www.lakelandvision.org to participate in our monthly survey related to today's show topic.
I said, welcome to the good life.
Listen Lakeland is brought to you as a collaborative project between Lakeland Vision, the City of Lakeland, and Hall Communications, a community working together to provide an exceptional quality of life. Thank you for being with us.